The sea that learned not to fight the wind. Stoic Bedtime Stories. A story for anyone who's tired of rowing against everything. There are times when the wind turns against us, and no matter how hard we try, rowing only hurts. Some call it giving up, others call it wisdom. This is the story of an old fisherman who one day stopped casting his nets and simply began to watch. The sound of the waves mingles with the distant murmur of a light rain falling on a deserted beach. It's late afternoon, when the sky is dressed in shades of gray, and the sunlight struggles to pierce through dense clouds. The air carries the smell of salt and seaweed, that unique fragrance only the ocean can produce. In this scene, one solitary figure stands out against the infinite horizon, the man on the rock. His name was Antunes. Every day he went to the same spot on the beach. He sat on a smooth rock polished by decades of sea spray, gazed at the ocean, and simply listened. The waves crashing onto the wet sand, the wind whispering among the shells, the fine rain creating tiny craters in the sand. Younger folks said he was tired of life, but in truth, he was more awake than ever, because he knew something many hadn't yet discovered. Not all effort is necessary. Antunes was 73. His skin was weathered by sun and salt, his hands thick and calloused, witnesses to decades of wrestling with nets, hooks, and storms. Yet his eyes now held something different, a calm that hadn't been there before, a serenity that seemed out of place for someone who had spent a lifetime battling against the forces of nature. Every morning, he would walk the same sandy trail. His steps were slow, measured, as if each movement were a silent meditation. He carried only a cup of steaming black coffee and a small, faded towel to sit on. The rock was his cathedral, the ocean, his prayer. While he settled down, Antunes observed the other fishermen preparing their boats. Younger men, full of energy and resolve, hauling heavy gear, checking nets, adjusting engines, all rushing against time, anxious to take advantage of every hour of daylight. He used to be like that. For 50 years, Antunes was one of them, waking before dawn, meticulously prepping his gear, studying the ocean conditions, mapping out routes. He was known as one of the most dedicated fishermen in the region. His determination was legendary. Even on stormy days when everyone else stayed home, he'd be out there, challenging the waves. But that was before he understood that not every battle is worth fighting. The turbulent waters of the past. Antunes used to be like everyone else, fighting the sea, wrestling the wind, chasing results, fish, achievements, and for many years, it took its toll. Bent back, repeated disappointments, rowing without getting anywhere. He remembered mornings when he woke already frustrated before even leaving home. The sea was too rough, the wind blew the wrong way, the weather forecast was grim, but he went out anyway because giving up meant failing, and failing was unacceptable. He would haul the boat by himself when he should have asked for help. He'd row against impossible currents when he should have waited. He stayed out in storms when he should have come back to shore. His stubbornness was both his strength and his downfall. For decades, Antunes believed a man's worth was measured by his ability not to yield. That persistence was always a virtue, and that stopping was synonymous with weakness. He remembered one specific morning about 5 years ago. The sky was heavy, the waves crashed violently against the pier, and every other fisherman had canceled their plans. But not Antunes. He saw it as an opportunity. Less competition, more fish for him. Alone he fought to launch the boat. The waves pushed him back to the beach over and over. His shirt was soaked with sweat and salt water. His hands bled as he struggled to grip the slippery rope, but he kept at it. He finally managed to get out to sea, against all signs that he should have stayed on land. What followed was a 6-hour struggle against 10-foot waves, winds changing direction every minute, and torrential rain that made it impossible to see more than a few yards ahead. He came home empty-handed, no fish, no dignity, only a backache that lasted for weeks and a hollow feeling he couldn't explain. That night, looking at himself in the mirror, Antunes saw something he didn't like. An old, tired man, fighting a war he couldn't win. His wrinkles told stories of unnecessary effort. His hunched shoulders were the result of carrying burdens he could have set down. He was a warrior without a cause, a soldier fighting an enemy that existed only in his mind. He sat on the edge of the bed and, for the first time in decades, allowed himself to question everything. Why did he keep forcing impossible situations? Why couldn't he accept that some days simply weren't meant for fishing? Why did he treat the ocean like an adversary when he could have treated it like a partner? In that silent early morning, with the distant sound of the waves drifting through the open window, Antunes began to see that there might be another way. The storm that teaches. Until one day, in the middle of a storm, he realized the sea wasn't an enemy. It was just the sea. And what hurt was fighting against what he couldn't control. The revelation came 3 weeks after that night of reflection. Antunes was out at sea on a day that started calm, but quickly turned dangerous. Clouds gathered unexpectedly, the wind picked up, and the waves began rising in a threatening way. Normally, he would have fought until the bitter end, tried to fish a few more minutes, pushed his luck a bit further, forced the impossible. But this time, something different happened. In the midst of the forming storm, Antunes stopped. He simply stopped. He let go of his fishing rod, turned off the motor, and allowed himself to feel what was happening around him. The wind wasn't cruel. It was just being wind. The waves weren't trying to sink him. They were just being waves. The rain that started to fall wasn't punishment. It was just rain. For the first time in 50 years of fishing, Antunes didn't see the sea as an adversary. He saw it for what it truly was, a natural force, neutral, neither malicious nor benevolent, simply existing. And in that moment of absolute clarity, surrounded by the storm that would have once terrified him, he began to laugh, a low, deep laugh that rose from somewhere deep within. He laughed at himself, at his own stubbornness and his desperate need to control the uncontrollable. The sea had never been his enemy because it had never been against him. The only foe Antunes had faced all those years was himself, his inability to accept that some things lie beyond our power. He navigated back to the beach with a lightness he hadn't felt in decades. The boat's motor purred softly. The waves gently nudged him toward shore, and he let himself be carried along, not forcing, not fighting, just flowing. When he reached land, other fishermen were waiting anxiously. They had seen the storm forming and feared for his safety. But Antunes was fine, better than fine. He was transformed. He put away his fishing gear for the last time as the fisherman he had always been. From the next day on, he would be someone else. The silence that speaks. After that day, Antunes was never the same. He stopped casting nets on windy days, stopped fighting the tide, stopped needing to find meaning in everything. He began to listen, to feel. Antunes' mornings took on a whole new rhythm. He woke up naturally, without an alarm, whenever his body felt ready. He made his coffee without haste, savoring the aroma that filled his simple kitchen. He walked to the beach without rushing, noticing details he'd previously overlooked. The texture of the sand beneath his bare feet, the changing shades of the sky every minute, the unique sound each wave made as it broke, like a piece of music that was always different, always new. His rock became a prime vantage point, from which he watched the daily spectacle of the ocean, not as someone who needed to extract something from it, but as someone who appreciates a constantly shifting work of art. He watched dolphins occasionally appear in the distance, leaping in perfect arcs. He saw seagulls gliding gracefully above the waves, riding air currents with an efficiency he now admired instead of envied. He studied the ships on the horizon, tiny dots coming and going, reminding him how vast the world is. Most of all, Antunes watched other fishermen, young and energetic, middle-aged and determined, veterans still fighting their own battles. In them, he saw a reflection of who he used to be: anxiety in hurried movements, frustration when the sea wouldn't cooperate, the stubbornness that made them persist even when everything said they should stop. He didn't judge, he understood. He knew each one would have to follow their own path and perhaps in time arrive where he had arrived. Some would find it sooner, others later. Some might never find it, and that was okay. Every journey was unique. Neighbors began noticing his change. Antunes, once known for his constant rushing and edgy energy, now radiated a nearly tangible calm. He spoke less, but when he did, every sentence carried a weight of wisdom that impressed people. Local children grew drawn to his serene presence. Sometimes they'd approach the rock where he sat, initially shy, then increasingly curious. Antunes welcomed them with a gentle smile, letting them sit beside him and watch the ocean. He rarely spoke much to them, but his presence taught what words could not: the beauty of contemplative silence, the value of patience, the peace that comes from accepting the present moment exactly as it is, the lesson of the tide. And one day, a young man approached and asked, "Why don't you fish anymore?" He looked out at the horizon and simply said, "Because there are days when fighting only takes us further away from peace." The young man's name was Miguel. He was about 25, with restless eyes and jittery hands of someone who hasn't learned to wait. He had been fishing for only 3 years, but was already showing signs of the same exhaustion Antunes once knew: the constant frustration of trying to control the uncontrollable. Miguel had watched Antunes from afar for weeks. He'd see the old man sit on the same rock every day, gazing at the sea with a calmness that intrigued him. Other fishermen spoke of Antunes with a mix of respect and bewilderment. "Poor Antunes," some said. "He's lost his will to live." But Miguel saw something else, a peace he himself desired. That morning, after another sleepless night worrying about the day's conditions at sea, Miguel decided to approach him. "Mr. Antunes," he said, still standing, hesitant, "can I sit here?" Antunes just nodded, indicating a smaller rock beside his. They remained silent for a few minutes. Miguel stared at the ocean, his mind churning. Antunes watched the ocean with a mind at rest. Finally, Miguel summoned the courage to ask the question that had bothered him for weeks. "Why don't you fish anymore? Everyone says you were the best in the region, that you knew the sea like no one else." Antunes kept his gaze on the horizon for a long moment. A lone seagull glided above the waves, drifting effortlessly on the wind. He pointed discreetly at the bird. "Do you see that seagull, Miguel?" The young man looked and nodded. "Is it fighting the wind?" Miguel observed more closely. The seagull seemed to float on the breeze, moving with grace and ease. "No, it's using the wind." "Exactly," Antunes said softly, his voice as gentle as the sound of the waves. "It took me 50 years to learn what that bird is born knowing. Because there are days when fighting only takes us further away from peace." Miguel felt something shift inside him, like a long-locked door beginning to open. "But how can we accomplish anything if we don't fight?" he asked, his voice carrying the anxiety of a generation taught that giving up is failing. Antunes gave a faint smile, recalling how many times he had asked himself the same question. "The question isn't how to accomplish things, Miguel. It's about what we truly need to accomplish, and when and at what cost." He paused to look at a group of fishermen struggling to launch their boat. The waves were high, the wind fierce, They kept pushing the boat over and over, only to be shoved back by the force of the water. You see those men? Soon they'll manage to set out. They'll battle 6-foot waves, a wind changing direction minute by minute. Maybe they'll come back with some fish. Maybe they'll come back empty-handed. But they'll definitely come back exhausted. Miguel watched, recognizing his own struggles in the fisherman's desperate efforts. And that's wrong? It's neither wrong nor right, Antunes replied. It just is. They're doing what they think they must. I did the same for 50 years. You've been doing it for 3. It's part of the journey. Journey of what? Of learning that not every current needs to be conquered, that not every wind must be challenged, that sometimes the best catch happens when we stop forcing and start flowing. Miguel stayed silent, processing these words. In the distance, the fishermen finally managed to get the boat in the water, but it was clear they faced a tough day. Are you telling me to stop fishing? I'm telling you to fish when it's time to fish, and not fish when it isn't. To fight when the fight brings something worthwhile, and not fight when the struggle only brings fatigue. Antunes stood slowly, his joints protesting gently. The sun was warming up, and he knew his morning of contemplation was nearly over. Wisdom, Miguel, isn't about never giving up. It's about knowing when to persist and when to let go. The sea will be here tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. It won't vanish just because today isn't the right day to fish. Miguel remained seated on the smaller rock, absorbing the words. Antunes began walking back home, but stopped after a few steps. Miguel? Yes, sir? Tomorrow, if the sea is calm and the wind is favorable, go fishing. But go because the day is inviting, not because you have something to prove. And he walked off, leaving the young man alone with his thoughts and the eternal sound of the waves. The wisdom of calm waters. In the weeks that followed, Miguel began to observe more, not just the sea's conditions, but his own inner state. He learned to notice when he fished out of genuine need and when he did it out of stubbornness. The difference was subtle, but crucial. Gradually, other fishermen started paying attention to the conversations between Antunes and Miguel. Some came by the rock, skeptical at first, then curious. Antunes never preached or offered unsolicited advice. He simply shared his presence, and when asked, delivered nuggets of wisdom refined by decades of experience. How do you know when it's time to stop? João asked one day, a 40-year-old fisherman who struggled with the same frustration everyone knew too well. When continuing hurts more than stopping, Antunes answered simply. But what if we need the money? What if our families depend on what we catch? A well-fed family prefers a father who's alive and healthy over one who's exhausted and ill. The fish we don't catch today might be caught tomorrow. The strength we waste fighting the impossible might be used for something productive. Antunes' words were like seeds. Not all landed on fertile ground, but those that did slowly began to sprout. Some fishermen started taking a closer look at conditions before heading out. Others learned to come back earlier when the sea signaled it wasn't a good day. Miguel soaked up the lessons more than anyone. He started fishing less often but more effectively. His time on the water became more productive because he chose his days wisely. His anxiety eased, his health improved, and surprisingly, his income did too. It's strange, he said one morning. Fishing less is giving me better results. It's not strange, Antunes replied. It's natural. When we stop fighting the river, we find it can take us exactly where we need to go. Acceptance as freedom. Antunes didn't get rich, nor did he go back to fishing like before. But he also never again fought the wind, because he understood that accepting what can't be changed isn't weakness. It's freedom. Months passed, and the seasons changed. Antunes maintained his contemplative routine, though he was rarely alone on his rock anymore. Someone was always nearby. Miguel, João, other fishermen. or simply townspeople who'd found in the old man's presence something their hectic lives didn't offer: peace. He didn't see himself as a guru or a teacher. He saw himself as someone who had learned to stop fighting life. And that learning, silent and steady, naturally radiated to those around him. His simple home stayed simple. He accumulated no material wealth. He didn't seek recognition or fame. His needs were few and easily met: simple food, basic clothes, a roof over his head, and daily access to the sea that had taught him everything. The fishing community began to shift, almost imperceptibly. Fewer accidents at sea, fewer fishermen coming back exhausted and frustrated, more cooperation among families, a growing realization that life can be lived with less struggle and more flow. Miguel, now 5 years into fishing, shared what he learned with newer fishermen, not through lectures, but by example. His calm demeanor at sea, his knack for making wise decisions about when to go out and when to stay, his skill at working with the conditions rather than against them. "What changed the most in you?" asked a childhood friend he hadn't seen in months. Miguel thought for a moment, watching the waves gently rolling onto the sand. "I learned that I can choose my battles. And most of the battles I thought I needed to fight, I really didn't." That was exactly what Antunes had discovered. Freedom didn't come from winning every fight, but from recognizing which fights were worth engaging in, and, more importantly, realizing that many of the fights he perceived were simply life being life. The wind wasn't against him personally. The waves had no agenda. The rain wasn't trying to ruin his plans. All of it was just the world being the world, and he could choose how to respond. He could fight everything, as he had for 50 years living in constant tension, or he could accept what he couldn't control and focus his energy on what he could influence: his decisions, his reactions, his inner state. The echo of transformation. A year after Antunes and Miguel first met, the beach had become a different place. Not physically. The same waves washed over the same sand, the same winds blew from the same direction. But energetically, something had changed. The fishermen spoke to each other more. They shared information about the sea. They helped each other when anyone ran into trouble. The desperate sense of competition had given way to a collaboration that benefited everyone. Families of fishermen noticed their husbands and fathers returned home less stressed. Children had parents who were more present, less obsessed with constant failure. Wives had more emotionally balanced partners. Antunes watched these changes with quiet satisfaction. He'd never planned on influencing anyone. He had simply lived his transformation in a genuine way, and that created ripple effects all around him. "Mr. Antunes," Miguel said one tranquil morning, "I think you've created something much bigger than you imagined." Antunes gazed at a family of dolphins that had appeared near the coast. They moved with a grace that seemed effortless, leaping and diving in perfect harmony with the waves. "I haven't created anything, Miguel. I just stopped destroying what already existed." "What do you mean?" "Peace was always there. Wisdom was always available. Harmony was always possible. I was just too busy fighting to notice." Miguel considered this. It was true. In the last 3 years, he hadn't learned complicated techniques or mysterious secrets. He had simply stopped doing what made him anxious and frustrated. "So what now?" Miguel asked, looking at the horizon where the sky met the sea in a perfectly serene line. Antunes smiled, watching the dolphins disappear in the distance. "Now you already know what to do. You don't need my rock anymore to find peace. You can find it anywhere at any time. The only difference is that now you know it's there." It was true. Miguel could access that calm, clear feeling even when he was far from the beach. In the midst of a storm, dealing with family issues, making tough decisions. Peace didn't depend on external circumstances. It depended on his ability to accept and flow. "Will you keep coming here?" Miguel asked. "For as long as my legs can bring me and my eyes can see the horizon," Antunes replied. "But not because I need to, because I want to, because I like it, because this rock and I have become old friends." Miguel understood the subtle but important difference. Antunes no longer depended on this ritual of contemplation to maintain his inner peace. He continued because it was a pleasurable choice, not a desperate need. What if people keep coming here for advice? They're welcome, but not to hear truths only I know, to discover truths they already carry inside. The legacy of serene waters. Antunes was now 76. He remained healthy, his mind sharp, his heart at peace. Watching the community around him, he saw the fruits of his silent transformation multiply in ways he never imagined. The beach became a destination for those seeking not just fish, but wisdom. It wasn't some commercialized spiritual tourism site. It was a place where simple living and serene acceptance were genuinely practiced by ordinary people. Fishermen from other regions came to study the cooperative, sustainable methods the community had developed. Researchers arrived, curious about the phenomenon of a professional community that had significantly reduced occupational stress without losing productivity. But Antunes knew none of this was about him. It was about a universal principle rediscovered. Life flows better when we stop fighting it. In his silent hours of observation, Antunes had become a living library of practical wisdom, not because of the books he read or theories he studied, but because of the countless hours of deep contemplation. Each morning on the rock was like a masterclass on existence, taught by the ocean itself. He'd learned to read subtle changes in the tide the way others read newspapers. He could tell if the day would be calm just by how the first waves touched the sand. He could predict weather shifts hours before the meteorologists, not by science, but by an intuition honed through patient observation. His wisdom surfaced in simple yet profound guidance given when people asked. To a young man anxious about the future, he'd say, "The ocean doesn't worry about the next wave. It is fully present in the wave that is now." To a worried mother of a rebellious teen, "High tide doesn't last forever. Neither does low tide. Everything changes, everything passes." On an especially beautiful afternoon, with the calm sea reflecting a cloudless sky, a little girl approached the rock. She must have been about 8, the daughter of one of the younger fishermen. Her eyes sparkled with that pure curiosity only children possess. "Mr. Antunes," she said, smoothing her colorful skirt before sitting in the sand next to the rock. "Why do you look at the sea every day?" Antunes smiled. Children always ask the most important questions. They hadn't yet learned to complicate the simple. "Because the sea teaches me new things every day, little Sophia." "What kind of things?" she asked, tilting her head with genuine interest. "Today, for example, it taught me that when water meets a rock along its path, it doesn't fight the rock. It simply goes around it." Sophia followed Antunes' gaze and watched the gentle waves rolling onto the shore. Some indeed encountered small stones, and instead of crashing hard against them, gracefully flowed around, creating little swirls. The girl thought about this for a moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. "And when we find a rock in our path," she asked, "we can be like the water. Instead of banging our heads against the stone, we can look for another way." "Oh," she said, as if a light bulb had turned on in her mind. "Like when my mom's mad and I don't try to argue. I just wait until she feels better." Antunes chuckled softly. Children's wisdom never ceased to amaze him. They grasped intuitively what many adults spent a lifetime trying to relearn. "Exactly. You already know how to be water." Sophia beamed, proud she'd understood something important. She remained silent for a few minutes, watching the sea as though she'd just discovered a secret. "Mr. Antunes," she said after a while. My dad sometimes gets really angry when he can't catch anything. He yells and throws things. Does that mean he hasn't learned to be water yet? Her question touched Antunes deeply. In her face, he saw not just curiosity, but a small soul beginning to perceive human patterns with impressive clarity. Your dad is still learning, Sophia. Some of us take longer to understand. But look at the sea. Even when it's furious during a storm, it always returns to calm. Your dad will learn too. Can I help him? You can be water around him. When he's a storm, you can be like a gentle breeze. Sometimes that helps people remember they can choose to be calm. Sophia nodded solemnly as though she'd just received an important mission. She stood, brushed sand off her skirt, and before running back to play with the other children, she turned and looked at Antunes. Thank you for teaching me about being water. Antunes smiled and waved as she dashed across the sand, but he knew the seed had been planted in extremely fertile ground. Perhaps she would grow up remembering that not everything in life needs to be a battle. The sea teaches. Those ready to learn months went by, and news of Antunes spread beyond the fishing community. People from different walks of life began appearing on the beach, each carrying the weight of their own inner storms. One morning, a middle-aged businessman arrived. He wore an expensive but rumpled suit as if he'd slept in his car. His eyes were red from stress and exhaustion. He hesitated for a long time before approaching Antunes' rock. Sorry to bother you, he said, his voice raspy with fatigue. I'm Ricardo Mendez. I run a construction company. A friend of Miguel's told me about you. I'm at the end of my rope. Antunes gestured for the man to sit on a nearby rock. Ricardo sighed heavily and sat down. My company is going under. 15 years building it, and now everything's falling apart. The economy, the competition, clients who won't pay. It's like the whole universe is against me. Antunes observed a crab struggling to climb a slippery rock. Over and over, it slid back down, but kept trying relentlessly. You see that crab? He asked. Ricardo nodded vaguely. It's been trying to climb that same rock for 10 minutes. It could pick a less slippery rock, go around another way, or simply find a different spot. But it insists on that specific stone. So? Ricardo asked, not sure where this was heading. Sometimes we're like that crab. So focused on a single stone, we don't see the whole ocean of possibilities around us. Ricardo fell silent, pondering the analogy. Antunes continued, Your company is in trouble. The question isn't how to force the market to behave as you want. The question is how you can adapt to the current conditions. But I built this company with my blood, sweat, and tears. I can't just give up? Antunes finished. I'm not suggesting that. I am suggesting you consider different ways of sailing. A skilled captain doesn't abandon ship during a storm, but he also doesn't insist on the same course if it leads straight to the rocks. Ricardo ran a hand through his hair, thinking, how do I know which new course to take? The same way a fisherman knows when the sea is changing. By observing, listening, feeling, by stopping the fight long enough to see what the environment is telling you. They talked for 2 hours. Antunes shared stories of fishermen who had learned to work with the seasons instead of against them, of boats that changed routes and found abundant fish, of communities that adapted to climate shifts instead of resisting them. When Ricardo left, he seemed different, not entirely cured, as that would take time, but with a fresh perspective. Weeks later, Antunes heard through Miguel that Ricardo had restructured his company, shifted focus to smaller but more sustainable projects, and was on the path to recovery. A teacher who rediscovered patience. Another memorable visitor was Helena, a high school teacher who arrived one Saturday afternoon, visibly worn down. She was around 40, but her slouched posture and weary gaze made her look older. Mr. Antunes, she said after Miguel introduced them. "I've been teaching for 15 years. I always loved my profession, but lately, I feel like I'm swimming against an impossible current." Antunes listened as she described her frustrations: disengaged students, absent parents, bureaucratic red tape, the pressure for results. It was the story of many dedicated educators struggling against forces bigger than themselves. "What frustrates me most," Helena said, "is knowing I have something valuable to offer. I know my subject, I love teaching, but it's like nothing I do can spark interest in my students." "Helena," said Antunes gently, "have you ever watched how the waves teach the sand to move?" She looked puzzled. "No, I'm not sure I follow." "The waves don't come crashing onto the sand yelling, 'You must move now.' They just arrive, gently, again and again, with infinite patience. And slowly the sand moves, not because it was forced, but because it was invited." She paused. "You're saying I'm trying to force my students to learn? I'm suggesting you try being more like the waves. Instead of fighting the students' resistance, find out where it comes from. Instead of pushing the curriculum, look for ways to connect it to what they already care about." In the following months, Helena changed her approach. Instead of battling her students' disinterest, she observed them more carefully. She discovered that many had personal problems distracting them. Others had different learning styles than what she was used to offering. Gradually, she adapted. She added more visual elements for those who learned better that way. She drew parallels between classic literature and the pop culture her students consumed. She listened more and talked less. The result was remarkable. Not only did student engagement improve, but Helena herself rediscovered her joy in teaching. She returned to the beach months later, grateful, wanting to share her epiphany. "I learned that teaching isn't about overcoming students' resistance. It's about finding the natural current of their curiosity and sailing with it." The couple that stopped fighting. One of the most moving stories Antunes witnessed involved Maria and Carlos, a 50-something couple on the brink of divorce after 25 years of marriage. They showed up on a Sunday morning, clearly reluctant, walking separately across the sand. They avoided eye contact. Maria approached the rock first. "Our son said we should talk to you," she said, her tone skeptical. "I'm not sure how a retired fisherman can save our marriage, but we've run out of options." Carlos stood several feet away, obviously uncomfortable. "Have a seat," Antunes said simply. "Tell me about yourselves." What followed was an outpouring of mutual complaints. Maria accused Carlos of being stubborn and inflexible. Carlos accused Maria of being critical and controlling. They interrupted each other, each determined to prove the other wrong. Antunes let them talk for almost an hour, quietly observing the pattern of conflict between them. Finally, he raised his hand gently. "Do you see those two currents over there?" he asked, pointing to where two different ocean currents met, creating small whirlpools. They both looked in that direction, still irritated. "Are those two currents fighting?" asked Antunes. "What do you mean?" Carlos said. "The currents. Are they fighting over which is stronger? Which one is right?" Maria and Carlos looked more intently. The currents simply flowed alongside each other, forming interesting patterns at their convergence. "They're flowing together," Maria finally admitted. "Exactly. Two different forces coming from different directions that found a way to coexist. They're not trying to change each other, not vying for dominance, just being." The silence that followed was no longer tense. It was thoughtful. "You two have spent so much time trying to change each other," Antunes continued, "that you forgot to appreciate the differences that attracted you in the first place." They returned multiple times over the following months. Gradually, Maria and Carlos practiced this new metaphor in their marriage, seeing their differences as complements rather than obstacles. Carlos's inclination to plan everything balanced Maria's spontaneity. Maria's emotional openness softened Carlos's rigid practicality. Instead of fighting these traits, they learned to flow with them. A year later, they returned to the beach hand in hand. The multiplication of wisdom. Stories like these and many others created an interesting phenomenon. Those who visited Antunes not only carried away their own transformations, but also applied the principles in their communities and relationships. Ricardo, the businessman, began treating his employees differently, fostering collaboration over competition. Helena developed workshops for other teachers on fluid pedagogy. Maria and Carlos offered informal marital advice to other struggling couples. Miguel, widely considered Antunes' closest disciple, began receiving invitations to speak in other fishing communities about sustainability and occupational well-being. But he always shifted the focus from technical methods to core principles. Observe before acting, work with conditions instead of against them, recognize when to press on and when to pull back. Technique is just the surface, he'd say, echoing Antunes' teachings. The important part is understanding that not every force needs resistance. Not every current must be overcome. The eternal sea. As the sun began to set once more, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Antunes prepared to head home at the end of yet another day, one of thousands that were both the same and unique. He rose slowly from the rock, silently grateful for another day of clarity, another day of peace. His legs were stiffer than the year before, his hands more lined, but his heart was still light. He took one last look at the horizon, where the sun touched the water in a golden line stretching to infinity. In that view was the lesson that had changed his life, the beauty of acceptance, the power of non-resistance, the wisdom of flowing. The sea would still be there long after he was gone. The waves would keep breaking on the shore, the wind would keep blowing, and people would continue discovering, each in their own time, that not every current needs to be fought. He walked back home with unhurried steps, leaving footprints in the sand that would soon be washed away by the next tide. And that was okay. Some things are meant to last forever. Others are meant to exist only as long as necessary to serve their purpose. Antunes had found his purpose, to learn how to stop fighting what he couldn't control. And by doing so, he had inadvertently taught others to do the same. The sea that learned not to fight the wind was, in fact, a man who learned not to fight life. And in that acceptance, he found a peace no achievement could ever give him. A peace that spread like gentle waves, touching other lives, other stories, and other hearts ready to stop rowing against everything and start flowing with what cannot be changed. And on that smooth rock, polished by the sea air, the silent echo of his presence would continue inviting others to discover that sometimes the greatest victory is to stop fighting. Yes, the sea teaches, if you're ready to learn.